The good news about Pakistan is that there is a very, very important transformation that's taken place in Pakistan. Remember, this is a secular society in the heart of the Muslim world, where lawyers, civil rights activists, human rights activists, women rights activists, community organizers have begun to really demand a human rights-based system, a government that will respond to their rights. And the people of Pakistan want a secular government. They are very worried about the rise of extremism in Pakistan. So how do you marshal that? Unfortunately, the Bush administration has been on the wrong side of this equation because of its alliance with Musharraf, the former military dictator. The United States took a position where it didn't push back against Musharraf's dismissal of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the entire leadership of the Supreme Court that was showing signs of independence, very importantly, on two issues. One, on the presidential or the political ambitions of Musharraf himself that conflicted with the Constitution, but also about detainees. A whole slew of detainees had just disappeared, been disappeared by the military. And families were coming forward. People were really demanding accountability and to find their loved ones. The Chief Justice took both of these issues on in a very new and courageous way, which inspired people in Pakistan to really stand up for the rule of law in Pakistan. And the United States has been saying that we want democracies, human rights respecting democracies, to flourish in the Muslim world. Well, here we have one where the rule of law basically is fighting for itself. They're doing all the heavy lifting. They're doing the hard work. The lawyers protesting in the streets, rights activists standing up to the military, and the United States was standing with Musharraf in that struggle, and not insisting, for example, that he reappoint the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the independent-minded judges. The rest of the judges throughout Pakistan were watching this. They wanted to see some signal. Was this now the time when the judiciary would become fair and independent from the military dictatorship? This would be a huge signal. And the United States was wrong. The United States took the wrong posture. And as a consequence, we are still in a paralyzed situation. We have new leadership in Pakistan that's highly suspect, not well trusted. Many believe that the new leader, Zardari, is really corrupt. And that he himself is not committed to the restoration of the independence of the judicial system, or let's say the real establishment of an independent judicial system. And so there's a great anxiety now among human rights activists and lawyers in Pakistan, but they're ready. They are ready to do their part. The United States should do its part. In our assistance to Pakistan, in our relationship with Pakistan, our priority should be supporting the rule of law movement in Pakistan. That's a real movement. But also in really calibrating our aid. If we're going to give military aid, let's make sure that the Pakistani military, the Pakistani intelligence services are poised to do the job of identifying extremists, going after them, and dealing with them with Pakistani boots. The minute the United States starts finding itself involved there militarily, I think we're going very much down the wrong path. It's going to inflame nationalism in Pakistan, and it's also going to have, I think, ramifications for human rights more broadly in Pakistan, which is very bad news for the United States. I think human rights has to be a very high priority for the United States government in managing its alliances, and in managing its discussions with other governments. I think we can't expect that human rights will always be the #1 topic of discussion with foreign leaders. The United States has many issues, trade, environment, especially given the economic troubles that we're all confronted with. There are going to be other pressing priorities. But what has been true, I would say, particularly during the Carter administration, that's really been built upon by succeeding administrations, is really building frank and sincere discussions between the American president and his or her, in the future, discussions with foreign leaders. What worked for President Carter was, in his discussions with Brezhnev, he meant it. He sat down, he brought a list of people, and he had a very sincere discussion with the Soviet leader, had a list of people he wanted released, and he pushed, but it was very heartfelt. It wasn't sort of, well, I'm checking off my list of people, here you go. It was heartfelt, and it really had results. And I think other presidents have done that at different times. So it has to be at the heart of the discussions. It can never be left out. But until the United States returns to principles, absolutely prohibits torture, closes Guantanamo, closes down secret detention sites, ceases its policies on detainees of indefinite detention, etc., until it restores its own credibility as a country that can, without hypocrisy, speak about human rights, that discussion will always be strained. And it will also make the American position, if it's public and critical, a subject of ridicule in places like Russia, for example. Well, slightly more than 60 years ago, before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Atlantic Charter was adopted by Churchill and Roosevelt. And in that charter, the British and the American governments set out the framework for self-determination of all peoples. Okay, that set the groundwork for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights some years later, led, in fact, by Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady of the United States. Huge accomplishment. But I'm reminded of its legacy by the fact that in 1941, shortly after the Atlantic Charter, a young lawyer named Nelson Mandela, representing Black African liberation organizations in South Africa, made a public statement saying, okay, you are promising us self-determination, the idea of liberation from tyranny. We're going to take you on your word, and we are going to fight for it. That was in the middle 40s, early 40s. It took 50 years for that man to help liberate his country. But what it represents is a renewed ownership of the idea of human rights that started then at the height of colonialism. Don't forget, this was still a very highly colonized world. People have taken the idea of human rights and they have owned it. And that's the best news of all. It has been a bloody century. It was a bloody century. But what's happening now in the most far-flung corners of the world is that people, women, even children, people who were enslaved, people who were involved in human trafficking, people in every sphere that you could imagine, victims of torture, are standing up and saying, no, these are our rights and we're going to fight for them. And we're going to challenge the powers that be. And so the fact that this idea is not an American idea, it is a universal idea. And that's the good news. The challenge we have is political will, and is really understanding that we actually can help people who are struggling for human rights. We just have to learn how to do it better over the long term with smarter policies. Yes, if you remember during the Cold War, the United States entered into all kinds of alliances where there were gross violations of human rights. We can think Central America, Southern America, South America, Chile, Argentina, Central America, El Salvador. I think in our lifetimes can remember some of the atrocities that came to light. And the United States had to eventually back away from support, say, of El Salvador because of death squads that was publicized. But the Cold War, people remember that the Cold War was a civilizational struggle, and including during the Carter administration, where there were great compromises on human rights, and people were trampled in order to settle the dispute between East and West. What we see now is something similar. I would say worse, because the very principles of human rights have been gutted when you say that an individual, by virtue of their nationality, can be deprived of their rights, and this idea is condoned by the United States. A Muslim, a suspect, no right to challenge his detention. This takes the very heart of the concept of human rights. It sort of unravels the fabric of the idea of human rights. So that has to be restored, first and foremost. And I think the next president can do that. We are urging the next president to sign an executive order prohibiting torture. And the Congress must do something similar to ratify that decision. And that can be done. But once you do that, you still have a problem of the United States' relationships with other countries. So, for example, if the United States wants the government of Kenya or Ethiopia in regard to Somalia, or just pick a place, Egypt, to be tough on terrorism, you know, sort of in quotes, what that will do is give that government more emergency powers, more of an argument to curtail rights. And that's not in the interest of those societies, nor is it in the interest of fighting terrorism, because people will become frustrated. By the way, a Rand Corporation study that just came out recently was fascinating. And this is a very conservative think tank saying military intervention is not all that effective in countering terrorism, in defeating terror groups. What is the most effective? There are two things that I think over 85% of the time works for countering terrorism: politics and intelligence and policing. 7% of the time, military intervention has some beneficial impact. That's astounding for the Rand Corporation to say. So not only is it the way the war on terror, in fact, the Rand study also criticizes the terminology war on terror, because it gives this idea that this is a military campaign, when it really has to be intelligence, policing, and political persuasion to pull people into a process where their ideas can be tested out within their communities. This is very good news, because what it means is we might be able to return to a common sense approach to defeating terror and extremism, and also at the same time really helping to support democratic movements. Since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, various treaties have been entered into by governments all over the world to, in fact, to define what is human rights. You have the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention Against Torture. There are specific instruments that define human rights. And so that's good news, because it means we have a global understanding of what the rules are. Added to that more recently was the International Criminal Court, a body to actually hold accountable war criminals and those who commit the most heinous crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. So the rules are understood. Let's say they're well defined. Human rights are well defined, including the right to an adequate standard of living. It's very clearly stated both in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that an adequate standard of living, right to food, etc., these are rights. I think that scares people because they hear entitlements and the government must provide. It sounds like socialism. But what it helps us understand is that the human being is a whole being. It is not just a being that wants to have freedom of belief and conscience and freedom to assemble and write and think. Those are all very important. But do those rights really matter for the person and their family if they have no food, if they cannot get food, if they don't have clean water? So we have to understand that this is really about the whole person. And the human rights paradigm really is about raising the expectation of government to honor the complete person as they govern their societies. The United Nations provides a terrific framework for monitoring and reporting on human rights violations. There's actually a structure that exists that is very encouraging, but it's very weak. And people have to remember that the United Nations is just a collection of governments. The United Nations is the governments of the world. NGOs and civil society participate in the debate. They are there in the room. This is a positive development where they're able to influence the debate. But when the decisions are made, it's governments. So if they are weak, if these institutions are weak, like the Human Rights Council that was recently an upgrade from the previous Commission on Human Rights, if it's weak, it's because the governments have not made it a priority to make it strong. What we have to be able to do is persuade our governments that the UN is the appropriate platform where human rights must be monitored and, let's say, reported on, where violations of human rights must be exposed. If it's at the UN, the credibility of the accusation or the claim or the information is much greater than if it comes from a singular government. Then, you know, one single government can actually be accused of using information for their own political gain, their political advantage. And in order to overcome that, we desperately need for the United Nations, the African Union, the Organization of American States, these regional bodies, multilateral bodies also, to become better at monitoring and reporting on violations. You have committees at the UN that actually sit across the table from the government of the United States. For example, just recently, the United States submitted its report to the convention, to the Committee on the Rights of the Child on the issue of child soldiers. And the United States, in its report, admitted that the United States has custody of 2,500 minors in detention, in American detention. That it has, at some point, had 2,500 minors in detention. And this is a violation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child Optional Protocol on Children in Armed Conflict. And so the United States is sitting across the table from this committee saying their meeting is coming up to be able to say, okay, the committee will say, what are you going to do to rehabilitate and reintegrate these minors? So every government must go through that process. This is very good, but that system has to become stronger. It has to become more enforceable. The United Nations should have a peacekeeping force to go into Darfour to protect the civilians. The United Nations should have a peacekeeping force to go into to places like it did in Eastern Congo. Not a well-publicized crisis. 5.5 million people have perished in the conflict in Eastern Congo, partially due to hunger and disease, but created by the war. If there had been peacekeeping forces there from the beginning, I think we can say that number would not be as high. So the United Nations should have an enforcement mechanism. But it requires leadership by governments. The United States must re-engage with the United Nations. It must bring its political, its moral, its financial resources to bear to make that a real human rights body that can really do the work. Then governments around the world will not be able to ignore its reports and its decrees about human rights violations, its findings. Well, with regard to the International Criminal Court, I think it's one of the most important innovations with regard to the protection of human rights in recent times, maybe ever, because you have an independent prosecutor who can go after evidence wherever he or she finds it against people who have committed war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, and bring someone to trial. And we've seen with trials in The Hague that this is serious. This is not, sitting in a room and debating about a report from the Human Rights Council. This is people in the dock, leaders, former heads of state in the dock, accountable for these crimes. I hope it will have a deterrent effect. In order for that to, I think, become stronger, the United States must join the International Criminal Court. It must become a part of that structure. And if it does, I think it will be a huge contribution to the idea of accountability. But on the flip side of that, to prevent genocide, you have to remember, genocide is, stage 10. I don't know what the highest stage of cancer is, but stage 10 cancer, genocide. we have to get better at detecting problems further down, further ahead of time, before we start talking about genocide in Darfur. In Darfur, for example, human rights activists were raising the alarm bell about human rights violations in Darfur 3, 4, 5 years ago, well before people were talking about genocide. If we had listened to them, same thing in Rwanda. A UN special investigator warned about genocide in Rwanda 9 months ahead of time. We have the information. We've got to get better at prevention and really expecting our political leaders to take these reports of human rights violations seriously, as if it's a warning for the next genocide. And it could be anywhere. Look what happened in Kenya. Nobody expected Kenya to explode, except, guess who? The human rights activists and the people of Kenya who saw the warning signs: ethnic divisions, lack of constitutional framework, the lack of commitment on the part of the government to establish the rule of law. All of these issues were flagged well ahead of time by Kenyans themselves. So we've got to do a better job of listening to prevent these outbreaks of violence, and when they happen, we've got to be in a position to punish them. It's both a problem. First, we don't listen. Somehow we're surprised when we find, oh, there was information about this 3 years ahead of time. We have no excuse for being surprised. The information is there. So, number one, we have to learn to listen better and to bring into the policy-making process those voices of people who are there. It's their job to know these things ahead of time. Human rights activists, etc., lawyers, people who are watching within their own societies. Okay, but secondly, there's a disconnect between sort of nodding politely when you hear these reports about human rights violations escalating, and then being able to challenge your own leadership in your government, say, to say, hey, we ought to do something about this. Why not, raise this at a higher level, with a higher level level of urgency with that head of state? So the political will, both are needed. We've got to do a better job of listening, and we've got to create some way, a systematic way to reach out to those voices, bring them in, and then translate that into political will, so that, and it goes back to the earlier question about how should it figure into our conversations with foreign leaders. That's why, because we can prevent the next genocide. The question is, are we willing to do it? Are we willing to put it to those who will be responsible in the future, might be responsible in the future? We don't know, but we have to assume that where the abuse of power is possible, it's highly likely.